Let's move on to our next presenter, Dr. Shavonn Lynch. Please present.
So before I begin, I do want to mention one thing. Dr. Marlena Graves was the second person that was on my committee, and so I want to lift up her for her graciousness to be a part of my process as well. So I didn't want to miss out on the opportunity to say thank you to her as I try to find a way to make this bigger. So, good afternoon. My name is Shavonn Lynch, and as you can see, my dissertation is titled Unnamed Women of Yesterday and Today. So, as an introduction, when I started the DMIN program, there was a lot of things that were going on for me in my life. I started after I completed the MDiv program. So, I need to just preface it. In 2020, we understand that the COVID had hit and we were in lockdown. And so in May of 2020, as I was completing my MDiv, I wasn't sure what to do with myself. I was still going through the process of becoming ordained through the Presbyterian Church, which I'm still going through. I was preparing to take my exams, and I said, okay, God, what am I supposed to do in this moment? Where are you leading me? And how am I supposed to um, deal with the pandemic? Because I was living alone. I didn't really have anybody else to talk to. So I was talking to God an awful lot. During the summer, as we know, there were a lot of protests going on surrounding the death of George Floyd. But as the summer progressed, we learned more and more about a woman named Breonna Taylor. And when I learned of her death, I thought she had actually died after George Floyd and was shocked to hear that she had died several months before him. But we had never really heard of her name and we never really heard of her story. And so that kind of hit really hard for me. Why had we not heard about this woman? And why did it take the death of this Black man for her death to be recognized? And so I want to share two things that happened in my life between the time I started, uh, between the time I applied for the DMN and the time I started. The first incident occurred, I was home and I was alone. And I had a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I didn't know who it could be. And so I asked, and it was the police. And I froze. And then I asked again, who? Because my thought is, why would the police be knocking on my door? What could they possibly want? I hadn't called them. I had no need for them. I wasn't anticipating them to arrive. And so as I opened the door, I came face to face with this officer who was looking for an apartment. Uh, and so when he looked at his paperwork, he didn't see the apartment. He said, this apartment does not exist. It must be a typo. So you must be the person that I'm looking for. And I froze because I wasn't. And so here I was trying to explain to this officer where he could find the apartment he was looking for. But my heart was racing. My mouth was heavy. My tongue was dry. My mouth was heavy. And I had no idea why I had felt such a way about this brief encounter with this officer. But it made me think of the death of Breonna Taylor and my own story in my own life. And it kind of hit really hard because after he walked away, it took a long time for me to find my breath and to calm down and to think about why did I feel this way? I hadn't done anything wrong. But the reality is, if I hadn't been able to convince this person he was at the wrong apartment, maybe my encounter would have been wholly different. And so that was the first thing that I experienced during the summer of 2020. The second thing I experienced was becoming a single parent. I took in my niece, who was 7 years old, at the time in September of 2020. And so I went from being the single woman to being the single parent. And at that time, I was going through the process of ordination, and I had all these exams to take. I had accepted into the demon program, and now all of a sudden I found myself with this little girl standing in front of me. And so I said, God, why? Why now when I'm going through so much and I have no idea how to incorporate this little person into my life right now? So what is going on? Why would you lead me to this place? So when I started the demon program, my heart was heavy and I was carrying a lot of anxiety. But those two events in my life led me to the topic of unnamed women. One was a cultural, contextual situation, and the other was a very personal situation. And yet, both of them, when I thought about what would I focus on when it came time for me to do the demon, it made sense. Both of these events had such an impact on what I would focus on and why. So when we talk about the Say Her Name movement, we talk about this idea that we say a woman's name so that we don't forget her story. And yet, that's the ideal situation. It's not always the reality of what happens. Sometimes we learn a story and we don't remember who told us or where we heard it from, but the lessons we learned stay with us and have a deep impact on us. And the second one being so personal that when I went to look at the stories of the Bible, initially I was drawn to Esther and Ruth and the Marys, but they didn't speak to the situation that I was going through. As I looked at the Bible, those women who didn't have a name spoke louder than the women that did. The first woman I encountered in the Bible was the woman who had lost her husband, and she was now widowed with 2 kids and wondering how in the world she was going to make it, to take care of these children. And so as I looked deeper into the Bible, I was more drawn to those unnamed women. They spoke to me. And so I believe that these women, they speak to, I don't want to say ordinary women, but yeah, ordinary women who are living ordinary lives, people who are trying to survive and thrive in a world that doesn't always see them or acknowledge them. I was now this single mother with a little girl. I wasn't working, and so I was in need of help. I was needing so much, and I became this unnamed woman who was now um, an unwed mother, if that makes sense. And so when I started this project, I had a deep need to unpack what I was feeling because I was living alone and I was dealing with the, the pandemic on one side and this new parenthood on the other side. I needed a place to express myself. And that's where the idea of the unnamed women of yesterday and today came from. Having chosen my topic of dissertation, I met with my advisor, Dr. Sakura, and when he proposed to me the two options I had, he said, you can either do a practical component or you can do a research-based component. I knew in an instant that I needed to do the practical component because it just made more sense for my own situation. I knew I needed to prepare something for a woman like me who could have that concrete sort of thing in front of them. My head wasn't in a space to do research based. I just didn't have it in me. And it was so much more personal to have that practical approach. So as I looked through and I came up with the women I wanted to focus on, I settled on those women who had agency, who made an impact in their own lives. I focused on the women who weren't just acted upon, but who acted on their own behalf. And so the first woman, I want to lift up the woman, um, the Syrophoenician woman. I chose her as my example to kind of help you understand how I went from one place to another. So we see this woman in Mark. She is a Syrophoenician woman. And so we meet her as she is entering the space where Jesus is. Jesus has entered the region of Tyre, and he's gone here not to engage these people, but to hide away from the multitudes and to restore himself. And so he's not in Tyre to do ministry, he's in there to rest and find restoration. And so, in here, I mentioned Ezekiel 26 through 28, those chapters, because when you read those chapters, you understand that there's a prophecy against Tyre. The people aren't exactly friendly to the Jewish nation. They are ones who have been prophesied because of how they have treated the Jewish people. And yet, here Jesus is in this region, gone to find rest. And so this woman approaches him. She's a Gentile, he's a Jew. She is Syrophoenician and he is Jewish. Jesus is itinerant, and this woman clearly has a home that she has left to find him. But she crosses this boundary. But the more I thought about her story, she's at home where she's supposed to be. Jesus has crossed this boundary and she has found him in that space. When I think about her story, I think about the fact that this woman is alone. It doesn't say that she's accompanied by anyone. She is in need of a healing for her daughter. So she has approached Jesus because if she had not, her situation may not have changed. And so as I look at this woman, this Syrophoenician woman, I realize that words become a key element to her story. For one, the woman has come as an advocate. She has come speaking on behalf of her child who has afflicted in need of healing. But when she gets there, instead of finding kindness and mercy, she finds rebuttal and rebuke. Jesus says as much that I've come for the people of Israel. I've come for the children of God, the chosen ones. And he uses the term dog. He said, I've not come to feed the dogs. It's not right to take food from the children and give to the dogs. That to me it's harsh. And in my personal, I probably would have walked away and said, okay, I would have been defeated and just walked. But this woman was so invested in her child that that wasn't an option for her. And so she takes these words and she flips them around. And even though she came for a word from Jesus, it's her own word that has the impact. Jesus says, because of her response, her daughter's been healed. So even though she approached Jesus um, for his healing word, it was her own that made the difference. And then I thought more about this woman's story, and I thought, we often hear that that people come to Jesus, that the crowd presses in on Jesus, but not this woman. Her daughter's at home. There's a distance and a space between them, and yet her faith in the word of Jesus is so strong that's all she needs for her daughter to be healed, not recognizing that her own words have power and agency as well. And so she's just one of the examples of someone on the margins uh, who made an impact on her own situation based on her words. So I say she's on the margins because here she is a woman. She's essentially alone. She is talking to this man on her own. Um, but when I think about my own experience uh, as a single parent, that's often frowned upon. Not that she might have been, but for me myself, it puts me in her shoes and what I would have done. So when I look at her in that way, I can kind of focus on her as someone who represents a woman on the margins. And so I wanted to bring us and take her situation and bring it forward. I've only highlighted the woman with the Syrophoenician woman with the afflicted child. But as I looked at her story and coupled it with all the others, I found that there were a few things that came to mind. The first was that these women are not unknown to God. Their stories taught me and reminded me that no one is nameless to God, that none of our identities are hidden from God. They're always in view. So even though I don't know her name in this story, I can rest in the assurance that whatever it is, God knows and sees. It's not hidden. And the second thing that came to mind was that our stories, our lives matter to God, who looks beyond our circumstances and uses us according to God's purposes. When we look at the woman, she she stood her ground, um, being able to stand in the face of that sort of rebuke is defiance. It's an act of defiance. And I believe that God can use that. That's something that we can take as women on the margins, that we can be defiant even in the face of such adversity. And that brings me to my next point. Even those on the margins can make an impact of their lives. Um, had that woman turned around and walked away, had she given in to that rebuke, this story could have ended very differently. And yet, uh, in her invested interest to advocate for her child, she made that impact. And sometimes it feels like we're not able to make an impact. But until we stand and we take a chance, we don't really know how impactful our actions can be or our words can be. And then faith, hope, love, and generosity are all acts of defiance in the face of people whose lives may not seem or as valued in society. So I take it as not just her story, but when I look at the woman with the alabaster jar, when I look at the Samson's mother, and then I look at the Shunammite woman, each of these women has shown an act of faith, hope, love, and generosity. And I believe that when we are faced with difficult situations, when we are faced with situations that are meant to break us, being able to stand and show those things are an act of defiance. Um, and that's something that we can take away from these stories. That's something that can inspire us to move forward. And then as people of faith, as whether we're in a church, whether we're alone, I think it helps us to be reminded that it's so important to create spaces for the marginalized people to tell their own stories, to tell it in their own words, because sometimes we try to give words to a situation and it's not actually the situation at hand. So it's always so important to have that space for others to be able to express themselves in their own reality in their own way. And then, being able to use our platforms. I'm not in a church right now, but I do hope to be in one soon. And I hope that as I step into the role of being in a church setting and being in a position or having a platform, that I have the courage, like this woman, to stand and say, this is what I believe and this is what needs to happen. And to use my voice so that I can advocate for people who are ignored or unheard or silenced. And then the final thing I do want to lift up, I want to lift up the idea that the Say Her Name movement is a very specific form of marginalization. It talks about violence that women um, have suffered at the hands of law enforcement. But that's very specific. That's one kind of marginalization. And so I want us to look at a few statistics because I believe statistics tell a story. They tell a story of what's going on in the African American or the Black woman experience. And so when I look at this, African American women only make up 13% of the women in the United States. That's a really low number when you consider the percentage of like 35% of Black women account for the missing. There's only 13% of us as women in general, but we make up such disproportionate numbers of missing and endangered, of of women who are murdered, poverty, unemployment. Uh, Actually, when I looked at this, poverty and unemployment is highest among American Indian and Alaskan Native women. Those women make up even smaller groups in the United States, and yet they have such a high rate, a disproportionate rate of poverty. Um, and so these numbers speak for these women. We don't know all their names. We don't know all that they're going through, but when we look at the numbers, we realize that there's a story there. There's something to be said about not holding on to say her name to remember because we don't know their names, but we still need to remember that something is happening to these women. Something is happening where their lives are being greatly affected despite their disproportionate numbers in society. There's something going on. And if we wait to say their names, we're going to miss out on telling their stories. We're going to miss out on looking for them. We're going to miss out on knowing who they are as best we can. So I think we have to remember that statistics tell a story, even if we don't like what they have to say. They're there and they do remind us of the situation and the reality that Black women in this country and society face. So
Right.
that's where I landed is there are stories to be told. Um, and even when we don't remember their names, we can remember that there is something about their lives that contributes to the reality and the story of a nation, of society. And so going back to the unnamed women of the Bible, what helps me to really dig into those unnamed women is because I believe wholly that they contribute to the wholeness and richness of the biblical story just as much as those named women do, and possibly and sometimes even more. Because they're not named, we can place ourselves in their stories so much easier. I'll never be a Ruth, or I may never be Esther, I may never be a Mary, but I might be that unnamed woman whose children are hungry and I'm fighting to figure out how to feed them. And so that's where I can place myself. And so this dissertation was very personal, and it wasn't a very academic pursuit, honestly. It was definitely a personal unloading of my grief and all that I was dealing with. It gave me space to put my thoughts and feelings into words, in a way that I couldn't because I was so alone. And I have one final, so for my final product, I mentioned that I was doing a practical component. And so, as a practical component, I actually came up with a Bible study that could be used. And this is it. I've published it on Amazon.com, and it's also available through Kindle. So for this Bible study, I didn't want to just talk about those stories. I also wanted the person that was doing it to be able to put themselves in the narrative and to understand their own story. Not just in society, but as part of the biblical narrative. We're still living out the good news of the gospel. We're still living out God's purpose for the world. And so, how do we fit in and how do we hold on to our narrative as we sometimes just fight to be seen or heard or validated or whatever, because it still matters and it still counts to God. Mm. So
Very
that's
good.
what I've,
I'm sorry, Siobhan, finish your thought.
and that's what I have left to share.
Thank you so much. Once again, a very thought-provoking dissertation and presentation. We have time for maybe one or two questions for Siobhan. Deborah.
Just have to find the unmute button. So thank you, Shavonn. Very moving presentation. Can you talk a little bit about your actual research, the throughput from your ideals, your first your statement that led all the way through to your conclusions? What was the premise?
So my chapter 3, I didn't mention, but my chapter 3 was a literature review. And so I did those unnamed, I talked about women in the Bible in general. But for myself, I also talked about the womanish perspective of how I believe in the communal aspect of our faith, and not just it's not like Dr. David was saying, not just a me, it's an us, it's a we. And why I believe that the contribution that the unnamed woman makes is relevant to all of us, even if we're not a marginalized person. There's still value in their contributions, and their stories add a richness to who God is, right, in the biblical narrative. So that's my chapter 3. And then my 4 and 5 are my detailed analysis of those women. So chapter 4 is the Old Testament, chapter 5. And so what I did is I broke down not just the stories, but how they fit in a larger narrative. And then my chapter 6 are those lessons that I got out of the 4 and 5. And so I kind of built from out here to in here, and how these stories they to me they speak to um the marginalized woman. They speak to but they also speak to who we are as society. If we listen to those stories, they circle back around. And so that's where so I didn't do research based. I did more of a detailed analysis, and I brought it back to those lessons. And then that's where the practical component comes in. Because I didn't do research based, I had to do like a hands-on sort of, this is what a tool. I came up with a tool that can be used by people instead of focusing on the research based product.
All right. Any other questions? Dr. Gerhard, please.
Yeah, just a comment. I just wanted to thank you, Shavonn, because you also expressed such vulnerability in sharing your story and how it shaped your research and work. And I just want to affirm it's such a contribution also to women's studies and those of us who teach in this area, and also in trauma studies, and the power of naming and recognizing and including and giving voice to. So I just want to thank you for that, because I know it takes a lot of personal vulnerability and courage to share what you've shared. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again, Siobhan.